This lecture is going to walk you through some ideas from Cowan and Spiegel's chapter on epistemology. This is chapter 2 of the Cowan and Spiegel text. So, as you know, epistemology is the study of knowledge, and so this chapter will deal quite a bit with knowledge and how we come to have it. So, the first way in which the chapter unfolds about knowledge deals with skepticism. So, Cowan and Spiegel call this the skeptical hypothesis, and this is over on page 51. They list out the skeptical hypothesis, and what they say is that the skeptical hypothesis means that we can doubt all or most of the ordinary beliefs that we typically take for granted. Right? So, in other words, take any belief that you have, it's possible for you to doubt that belief. Okay, so now that seems fairly reasonable. You might experience, you might hear a sound and say of a fire engine or a police car coming towards you, and you might feel like you just got in a bad accident. But then you wake up and you realize, oh, that was a dream. Everyone's been like in a dark place, maybe on a path, and you see something in the path in front of you, and you jump back because you think it's a snake, but it turns out really it's a tree root or something, right? We've all had experiences where we have doubted all of our ordinary beliefs. So many of the beliefs that we have, since they're dubitable, since we can doubt them, this means that we should be skeptical about them, according to the skeptic. So the skeptical challenge goes something like this. If there's a skeptical hypothesis for any proposition P, then I don't know that P. So P is some belief or idea or concept maybe. In other words, if you can doubt the belief that you have, then you don't really know it. And since there is a skeptical hypothesis for all of our beliefs, therefore the skeptic will say, you don't know anything. So this is kind of a bummer. It seems like we do know many things, but since the skeptic says we can doubt all the things that we know, therefore they conclude we really don't know anything. So Cowan and Spiegel give you a couple of responses to this, which come to show the kind of two major branches of epistemology. One is called a rationalist approach, and the other is called an empiricistic approach. So the rationalist focuses on what's called a priori knowledge. A priori knowledge. This means before experience. In other words, they say, look, there's many things that we know before we even have any experiences that can give us a foundation for certainty in order to avoid the skeptical challenge. So one of the famous philosophers who advocated this sort of response to skepticism was a French thinker named René Descartes. And he argued that both the self and God are two foundations for our knowledge, So over here on page 53, which is in the left-hand side of the screen here, they give a long passage from Descartes, which you can read. And the one thing that Descartes said that he couldn't doubt was the fact that he exists, because he knows that he's thinking. In other words, you can't doubt that you're doubting if you're doubting. In other words, if you're doubting, then you must exist to doubt. So therefore, you can't doubt that, and therefore, you can know that. But if you can know that, then that provides you a way out of skepticism. He also thought the same thing was true about God. We could know that God exists, and since God is not a deceiver, this is this argument here on page 53, since we know that God is not a deceiver, therefore he guarantees our knowledge, and therefore we don't have to be skeptics. The only problem with this challenge is it often works in a circle. His argument seems to be circular. It's sometimes called the Cartesian circle. In other words, Descartes seems to be either smuggling in assumptions about, say, the existence of God, or saying that we can reason from premises that are part of the conclusion that we've already given. And that's not good. Reasoning in a circle doesn't get you anywhere. So that's one alternative response, the rationalist response to skepticism. The next possible response to skepticism is called the empiricist response. So the empiricist says, look, we're not going to start with a priori knowledge, that is, knowledge apart from experience. We're only going to start with a posteriori knowledge, which is a knowledge from sense experience. From sense experience. And so the empiricist will say that we can use sensation and reflection to rely on what they call a representational theory of perception to give us probabilistic knowledge, that is, knowledge without certainty, of the external world which is causing our sensations. In other words, the idea is that, look, when you have an experience, right? When you have an experience, then say like of this tree, um, that tree produces in your mind an idea, an idea. In other words, this idea in your mind is supposed to have been causally produced by something outside of it, some sort of external cause. And this may not give you certain knowledge, but it certainly gives you very likely knowledge that that thing that's represented in your mind is actually there. And therefore, you don't have to be a skeptic. Okay, so that's kind of the empiricist response. Given the fact that we have these sense experiences, it's likely that the things outside of us exist. The problem is, there are various cases like hallucination where you might have a representation, right, with no object. You can hallucinate a tree, and it might just look as veridical or just like a tree. In other words, maybe the skeptic will say, maybe you're just hallucinating when you think you're experiencing a tree. Now, David Hume, was an empiricist who actually drove skepticism further than just the skeptic. What he says is, let's start with the representational theory of perception, like the idea that a tree produces an idea in your head or in your mind, and therefore you have just impressions. So this thing over here inside your mind, that's just an impression. It's an idea. And if there's no impression, you have no knowledge. But the problem with Hume is that there are many things which we can know which give us no impressions. For example, causality, God, and morality. In other words, sometimes if you think of like causation, that is one thing affecting another, even in the physical world, it seems like we have a pretty clear awareness that when you, say, knock down a line of dominoes, that there's a causal relation between the first domino falling and the last one. But Hume says you don't have any impression of that. All you see is individual dominoes falling, but what you don't see or have an impression of, and therefore no idea of, and therefore no knowledge of, is the causal relation between one domino falling and another. Also with God, Hume thought that, look, you have no impression of God. The qualities that exist in God are not transferred to your mind by any causal relation, and therefore you don't have an impression of it, therefore you don't have knowledge of it. Same thing with morality. Right? In a moral case, say a case of bullying, where someone is acting cruelly to another person by pushing them, shoving them, making fun of them. Hume says you can see the physical actions going on in the act of bullying, but what you don't see is any bullying. In other words, bullying is just an idea that we come up with from something we know not what. But there's no impression of it, so therefore there's no moral knowledge, according to Hume. Now, the way to avoid Hume's skeptical challenge, I think, is just to reject this notion of impressions. That is, the idea is that we do have knowledge of external reality, but it's not knowledge of ideas. In other words, for Hume, and for Locke as well, and all the other empiricists, what we have is reception of ideas. In other words, on this figure here, in fact, let me copy this. On this figure here, according to the rationalists, let me just put this over here. According to the rationalists, you don't have, for the empiricists, what you know is your idea. You only know your ideas, right? These things inside your head or in your mind. What you don't know is this out here, the object in reality. So one way to reject Hume is simply to say that we can have knowledge, of objects, not merely ideas. In other words, when you say, "Yeah, I know what it's like to, feel the sand at the beach," what the empiricist will say is, "No, you really just know your idea inside your mind." But I don't think you have to say that. What you can say is rather, no, the qualities in the object of the tree are actually present in my mind, and they're the same qualities, albeit in an act of representation, not just in the object. But if they're the same qualities, then I really do know the object, not just my idea. So that's one way to get around or reject Hume's view. So, but you still might be wondering, well, doesn't skepticism win? I mean, isn't skepticism shouldn't skepticism be the default position? Well, not necessarily. One of the ways to respond to the skeptic is to say, we don't really need certainty. We really don't need certainty at all. We simply only need good reasons to think. Get the page number here is right. Um, that we don't need certainty in order to have knowledge. In other words, we can know or have knowledge without certainty. So this is over on page 60 of the text, and one of the key distinctions that Cowan and Spiegel make here is the distinction between a rebuttal of skepticism and a refutation. So let me say what this means. A refutation of skepticism would mean that you have to show that skepticism is false, right? So if you refute someone, that means you're giving arguments to show that their view is false. But a rebuttal just means that the skeptic hasn't proven their point. In other words, to give a rebuttal to skepticism, to rebut skepticism, is just to say that skepticism has not been proven. That's different than saying I'm going to refute skepticism. So skepticism is always a possibility, right? Skepticism is always a possibility. But why should I think that it's a reality, right? I mean, sure, it's possible that we're in the Matrix. Sure, it's possible that we are hooked up to a machine. It's possible that I'm dreaming. It's possible that I'm hallucinating. But unless the skeptic can give me evidence to think that I actually am dreaming or hallucinating or in the Matrix, then why should I believe it? Why should I accept skepticism? That's the rebuttal. In other words, the rebuttal of skepticism says skepticism is a mere possibility. But there's no reason to believe it. Now, if that's the case, then of course skepticism hasn't been refuted, but it certainly hasn't been established. So one of the ways that we need one of the things we need to remember is that we do know many things after all. There are many things that we do know that are certainly possible that we could be mistaken about them. But that just means that we can have knowledge without certainty. Certainty is not a necessary condition to have knowledge. So if that's possible, then what that means is certitude can come in degrees. So if you look at this little list over here on page 62 of the text, Cowan and Spiegel will give you a couple of things about skepticism. Right? There are things that could be beyond all doubt. Maybe that's something like, I know that I exist because I'm thinking. Beyond a reasonable doubt, right? For example, the knowledge that you have two hands, or that you have a body, right? That's beyond a reasonable doubt. Now, of course, you can doubt that you have a body, or that you have 2 ears or whatever, or you have an ear or a nose or whatever. You can doubt that, but it's beyond a reasonable doubt. Or things that are more probable than not, right? It's more probable than not that the past is real, right? That seems more likely than not. That is, you can doubt that you came into existence um, more than 10 minutes ago. You can doubt that, but it's more probable than not that you've existed for more than 10 minutes. And then equally probable and improbable. Sure, right? I don't know. Take a prediction about the future. Right? Do I know that the Padres are going to win the World Series? I don't know. It's probable and maybe improbable, maybe equal. I don't know about that. Padres for sure, given their record of the past few years, but they're doing okay for now, right? So certitude and maybe even knowledge might come in degrees, but certainly certitude comes in degrees. Okay, that's just a little overview of this section of the text. Let me pause here and go to the next video on 2.2. Stay psyched, Grom. You.